Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is Opportunities and Barriers Shaping the Offshore Wind Market in the Northeastern U.S. This webinar is being hosted by Clean Energy Group, and specifically by Stori. Val's a project director here at Clean Energy Group. This webinar is a presentation of the Northeast Wind Resource Center. We'll explain all of those things a bit more in a moment, and we'll introduce the excellent panelists that we have on the line. But first, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using your telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. And there will be some instructions on your screen depending on which option you choose. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can click the little orange or red button that you see circled here. That also works to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we encourage you to submit questions and comments as you think of them throughout the webinar. You can do that by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we will address as many as we can during our Q&A. We'll have about 15 minutes for that at the end of our presentations. So type your questions in when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. We expect to have a lot of questions, and we want to make sure that we get to yours. So type it in when you think of it. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 24 or 48 hours with a copy of the webinar slides and the recording. And you can also find the webinar recording on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So with that, I will turn it over to our host for this webinar, Stori.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Pleased to have a few excellent panelists talking about the roadmap project for multi-state cooperation on offshore wind. As Sam mentioned, this webinar is being brought to you by the Northeast Wind Resource Center, which is a DOE-supported wind information and outreach center for the Northeast, spanning land-based wind and offshore wind issues. Specifically, it's a grant from the U.S. DOE's Wind Exchange Program, which you can see more information about on the next slide. Sam? We are one of now, originally 6, now 5 wind resource centers in the Northeast. And for offshore wind issues, we've been focused on interstate cooperation and stakeholder engagement for achieving cost reductions in offshore wind. So through that effort, the Northeast Wind Resource Center, which is managed by the Clean Energy Group and in cooperation with its sister nonprofit organization, the Clean Energy States Alliance, lots of acronyms here, and CISA has helped to coordinate this roadmap project for multi-state cooperation on offshore wind, which is the focus of today's presentations. We recently released 3 reports. The one that we will be focused on today is the Regional Market Characterization Report, which looked at the size, the potential size of a near and long-term regional offshore wind market given individual states' policy drivers, energy needs, and resource bases. Doreen will give an overview of the roadmap project in itself, and then Sustainable Energy Advantage will provide details on the Regional Market Characterization Report. Let me introduce Doreen, and then we'll move on to her presentation. And again, a reminder to type in questions as you think of them, and I'll moderate a Q&A session. Usually we save the Q&A for the end of the webinar, but if there are any clarification questions, we can ask those directly after Doreen's presentation. So Doreen Harris is the director of the Large-Scale Renewables team at NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. She is responsible for managing the centralized long-term procurement of utility-scale renewable resources in New York under the Clean Energy Standard, as well as oversight of future policy design, program rules, and market development mechanisms. She has received a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Rochester and has a Master of Business Administration from the University at Albany. Thank you for joining us, Doreen.
Thank you, Val, and thank you for the opportunity to present some interesting milestones on a project that commenced just about 2 years ago between New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. It is a project known as the Roadmap Project for Multi-State Cooperation on Offshore Wind. We conceived of this project, in fact, at a time when there were many interesting state actions expected but not officially underway, and in those 2 years there's been some very significant updates on the parts of the states that really lead to the development of a true regional market for offshore wind. So in that way we were looking forward and now are able to look back on what has been a very impactful couple of years. Next slide, please. So this project is the result of a grant that was issued by the U.S. Department of Energy's federally administered state energy program to NYSERDA. It was approximately $600,000. NYSERDA, were the primary recipient, but we're joined by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, and the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources in fulfilling the grant. As Val described, the Clean Energy States Alliance has served as the project coordinator for this effort. And again, the Roadmap project really sought to identify opportunities for cooperative action to help deploy offshore wind in the Northeast at the scale necessary to reduce costs and establish a regional supply chain. Today we're here to talk about one piece of work from that study, and I'll describe, or from that grant. I'll describe a couple of others in addition. There were representatives from each of the participating states on a steering committee that set the project direction and ensured that the work products would be useful to the states. We also vetted our preliminary results with an external advisory committee, which was represented by a range of energy sector, economic, and environmental expertise. So we have sought to publish analyses that can inform our state's decisions on offshore wind and be useful to a wide range of stakeholders. Next slide, please. And so earlier this month, earlier in November, in fact, 3 reports were filed jointly by the multi-state collaborative, the first of which the cover you see here on the screen and is available both on NYSERDA's website as well as the individual states and through the links that Val just provided. This is the subject of today's webinar, which really looks at the opportunities and challenges associated with the scale of offshore wind deployment, really expected to serve New England markets and New York markets through 2030. So we'll have more on that in just a minute, but just to preview, next slide please, we also issued a second report which looked at the job impacts of this level of offshore wind deployment, both in terms of the types of jobs that we would see, as well as the needs that would exist in these states to fill that demand. There is a webinar upcoming on this particular report that if you received the notice on today's webinar, you'll receive the notice on the job creation webinar as well. And next slide, please. The last report that was filed earlier in November really was very technical in nature. It looked at the functional requirements and cost of constructing a purpose-built vessel which would comply with the U.S. Jones Act and really met the needs of the expected offshore wind industry in the U.S. So this is also available on our website. Finally, we will be filing the roadmap itself, which is more forward-looking in terms of where the states expect to be working together in the coming years, and that will be filed later this year in fulfillment of the grant requirements. Just a very brief update. I mentioned it's been an interesting couple of years. If you could turn forward a slide, please. New York specifically, next slide please, has advanced in that time the New York Offshore Wind Master Plan and a nation-leading commitment to advance up to 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. This was announced by Governor Cuomo earlier in 2017. and really allows the advancement of our master plan to look at the most cost-effective and responsible manner in which we can achieve the goals of the governor. So we have worked carefully over the last couple of years to develop the master plan. The plan itself will be completed by the end of 2017 and set the stage for some very important planning work by New York State to be ready to capitalize on this commitment. Next slide, please. As you can see from this graphic, and it's very indicative of the work that we're doing with Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that offshore wind is indeed a very regional resource. You can see the existing lease areas that are available to serve our collective demand. In addition, New York is looking to identify additional lease areas within the offshore study area as part of our master plan process. That, coupled with a process to procure offshore wind on a statewide basis, will set the stage for very significant developments in New York in the coming years. Next slide, please. Looking at Massachusetts, next slide. In August of 2016, Massachusetts had a very significant development in which Governor Baker signed legislation to launch offshore wind formally as a state. And in fact, the first solicitation is now on the street for the procurement of offshore wind by the utilities in Massachusetts, which is a very significant and noteworthy development. Next slide, please. The Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, in fact, is taking the lead on some significant work to develop various aspects of offshore wind related to supply chain, transmission, ports, other planning activities, very similar to New York's offshore wind master plan, and being advanced actively through the procurement by the utilities. We'll hear more about developments in these states in a bit, but obviously Rhode Island, last but not least. Next slide, please. We have the Block Island Wind Farm, which is the first offshore wind project to enter commercial operation in the U.S. And again, that happened in this time frame as well. December of 2016, the 30 megawatt 5-turbine project entered commercial operation and set the stage for Rhode Island really being a leader in the advancement of this new industry for the U.S. In addition, Rhode Island continues to be intimately involved in advancement of offshore wind for the region. On the slide now, you see some new developments from specifically the Southern New England Offshore Wind Energy Science Forum, which is being sponsored by the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council, BOEM, and other agencies with support from Deepwater Wind and Rhode Island Sea Grant that is coming up here in December at the University of Rhode Island. We also see the Department of Environmental Management being involved not just in the area, the Block Island project, but also in the broader planning activities of the region, again, given the regional nature of the resource. So just a very brief update from the states, but the intent for today is really to describe, if you turn to the next slide, the advancement of our first study and some details therein. So with that, I'll turn it back to Val to just introduce Bob and Jordan, who will be describing that study. Thank you.
Thanks, Doreen. Great. All right, so moving on to our next presentation, we have two panelists, Bob Grace and Jordan Shoesmith from Sustainable Energy Advantage. Bob Grace is the President and Managing Director of Sustainable Energy Advantage, which is a leader and innovator in renewable energy market policy, financial, and strategic analysis. Bob has advised 150 government, market participant, and nonprofit clients developing renewable electricity markets, policies, projects, and businesses. He has worked with a broad range of stakeholders and a diverse array of functions over his 33 years in the electric industry, the last 20 exclusively focused on renewable energy. Bob holds an MS in Energy and Resources from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BS in Energy Studies from Brown University. Jordan Shoesmith is a senior analyst at SEA. He joined SEA in August 2015 following the completion of his MA in Energy and Earth Resources at the University of Texas at Austin. Jordan supports a broad range of interdisciplinary analysis services on renewable energy markets and policies. He has a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from Baylor. I will turn it to Bob and Jordan, and just a reminder to go ahead and enter any questions into the question dialog box, and we'll take those at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Val. If you could confirm that you can see my screen and that we're all good to go.
Got it. We can see.
Okay. Great. So this is Bob Grace, the Sustainable Energy Advantage. Thank you very much for your participation today. We're going to talk, my colleague and I, Jordan Shoesmith and I, will be talking about the Northeast Offshore Wind Regional Market Characterization study. This is a project that most of the work was done, completed about a year ago, but has had a number of updates since as the states in the region and the industry have been rapidly evolving. We were supported in this effort by some subcontractors, AWS True Power, Daymark Energy Advisors, and Meister Consultants Group. And today we're going to introduce the report to you. The outline of what we'll be talking today will discuss the report's introduction and its objectives, as well as its contents. We will focus on the results, which were regional offshore wind deployment trajectories, and the analytical components or the methodology that we use to derive those trajectories, and then we'll tell you about how we put it all together to provide an offshore wind market assessment. And again, most of this analysis was completed in early 2016, has been updated. The industry has been evolving rapidly. We'll be pointing out along the way a few places where there's some new information that wasn't captured explicitly in the analysis, but should be taken into account as you all think about what to do with this information. Ultimately, the objective of the report was to answer a question. What could the scale of the offshore wind deployment be in the Northeast region in the near term and the long term, given all the things that it could influence that marketplace, the offshore wind resource supply chain, the individual state policy drivers and initiatives, and regional energy needs, and the existing resource base. So the objective then was to develop a very forward-looking estimate of the range of potential offshore wind deployment between now and 2030, and expressed as an envelope of potential deployment between a high and low installed capacity and associated energy production trajectory. Some other objectives of the analysis were to compile and summarize a lot of data that went into framing the analysis, but also provide something of a one-stop shop on information regarding offshore wind development potential in the region, electric system and market factors, including demand, the existing fleet, and transmission issues. Description of the state and regional policies, plans, and other initiatives that impact offshore wind directly or indirectly, and that are relevant to the future potential for building out offshore wind. The report content will give an overview here before we focus in on really the analytical components. The introduction of the report provides information on the background objectives and limitations of the report, as well as its organization. The next section focuses on offshore wind development potential and constraints. So this is one of the many factors that drive the potential for offshore wind, and looks at the resource potential itself, the technical potential, the developable potential, and then other factors like the lease areas made available currently and expected to be made available by BOEM, and the development pipeline, what's already under development. This section also looked at barriers and constraints to deployment, such as economics and permitting and supply chain factors, interconnection and transmission, and energy production and peak coincidence. The next major section of the study was focused on potential demand for offshore wind, and so this was considered to be market factors. We looked at the regional energy mix and energy demand. We looked at the opportunity created by regional baseload retirement for new supply. We looked for limitations We looked at limitations on the ability for variable energy resources such as offshore wind as well as land-based wind and solar to be able to pick up shares of the regional supply mix, understanding that without significant amounts of storage, those factors will have some natural limitations in terms of their contribution to the mix. We also looked at the potential demand for offshore wind that was driven by state and regional policies and plans. And this included procurement policies for renewable energy more broadly, as well as other resources, including transmission, which is an enabling factor for all of those renewables. Looking at renewable energy and environmental regulations, laws, and policies, state energy and climate and action plans. So those are all focused on renewables or low carbon emitting sources in general. And then we also looked at offshore wind specific goals and laws and policies, regulatory proceedings, proposals, development activities, proposed legislation at the time, things that have moved into actual practice, some of which Doreen has already described, as well as noting some more localized metropolitan municipal renewable energy goals and initiatives that could become relevant to the offshore wind marketplace. We then performed a market assessment in which we analyzed all of the drivers detailed in the prior chapters to assess the regional offshore wind market scale. We determined which factors might be binding under what conditions and the analytical components considered, and we developed our offshore wind deployment trajectories that we'll be talking about today. In a conclusion section, we interpreted some of these results and compared some of those trajectories to the current planned and targeted offshore wind procurement volumes in the Northeast, again, some of which Doreen had described already, and discussed possible areas for future study. In an appendix, we included a lot of the detailed analysis components that supported our ultimate analysis. So at this point, I'll talk about the results for the regional offshore wind deployment trajectories. Now, in coming up with these trajectories, our intent was to bound the most likely scale of future regional market for offshore wind. And so in putting out a low and a high trajectory, these are meant to envelop the majority of the probability space, not to say that offshore wind couldn't be deployed at either a lower or a higher level, but under most of the circumstances and most of the drivers dictated that the most likely outcomes would be found within this envelope. And we considered a number of quantifiable factors that could potentially bound offshore wind market other than the relative cost of offshore wind. And so I thought I'd provide a little bit of color on that. One might ask, why didn't we look at cost in terms of coming up with these trajectories? And there were a few reasons there. One was that the initial procurements and policies and other drivers are intended to overcome initial cost premiums. Today and in the past, certainly at the pilot scale, offshore wind has been more expensive than other renewables, but that, at least in the near term, is not a constraint. Certainly over time, cost will become a much more important constraint. In addition, the offshore wind cost is really a function of a number of other things: the scale of deployment, the market visibility, the development of supply chain, for example. And this analysis was considered and envisioned as an input to analysis of offshore wind costs at scale of deployment, offshore wind jobs and supply chain. And so in terms of the order of operations, that would have been rather circular. And in that respect, this provided and developed inputs that could be used in other studies to get a sense of scale and try to understand what that scale of deployment could do to cost. The obtainable offshore wind cost when deployed at scale, therefore, is going to be dictated by the scale of the Northeast offshore wind market and the market in the United States more broadly. And so our scope and our focus was focused on the Northeast, meaning New York and New England, in terms of their demands, and considering the share of mid-Atlantic supply that could potentially feed this region's market. So some of those New Jersey areas that Doreen showed in her map were considered potential supply that could feed the Northeast demand. The focus was on the Atlantic, so while there is development potential for offshore wind in the Great Lakes, that was not considered as part of this analysis. We also took into account some of the perspectives of the steering committee, one, to be cautious not to overstate the achievable potential, but on the other hand, to be confident that those procurement goals that are embedded in statute today in Massachusetts and New York would ultimately be met, that the states are committed to those goals. So in coming up with the offshore wind deployment trajectories, we developed a high and low trajectory, both in number of megawatts, shown here on the left, and in gigawatt hours per year, shown here on the right. So they take a very similar shape, of course, and show that from a very slow start, we would expect on the low end deployment to reach around 4,000 megawatts of offshore wind in operation by 2030, and as high as roughly 8,000 megawatts with corresponding energy production to match. Some of the benchmarks to align with those volumes are important to focus on. So one comparison is with offshore wind procurement volumes that are and have been developed by the states. In law right now, Rhode Island has a statute which would allow 100 to 150 megawatts of offshore wind procurement in federal waters, in addition to the 30 megawatts already deployed in state waters. And as Doreen has already mentioned, Massachusetts has adopted legislation and is undertaking procurement aimed at soliciting and driving 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind to service Massachusetts. And similarly, New York has established a goal of 2.4 gigawatts, which lead to a total of slightly more than 4 gigawatts. And for comparison, you can see here how those procurement volumes line up with our trajectories. At the end of the day, those procurement targets are expected to be met by 2030 and, in effect, provide the floor for our trajectories. There are a couple of new developments which weren't considered in this analysis but are worth pointing out. One, very recently, New Jersey Governor-elect Murphy had campaigned on developing 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Those volumes are not explicitly considered in this analysis, but provide more heft to the potential supply in the mid-Atlantic that could be available to the Northeast. And also recently, Connecticut passed a law which altered some past procurement authority that was adopted in 2013 to allow procurement of offshore wind. And the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection just earlier this month signaled its intent to seek proposals from offshore wind and some other resources which could potentially drive up to another 270 megawatts of offshore wind. Again, not explicitly taken into account here. So at this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about the analytical components and the methodology, and then my colleague Doreen Shoesmith will drill down into some of the details. The components that were considered in developing the offshore wind trajectories were really divided up into three components: offshore wind characteristics, and so here we considered resource potential, the current development pipeline, current and future lease areas, as well as the constraints on the feasible pace and density of build-out, which is a function of spacing of turbines, but also importantly the supply chain, the ability to have the ships and other facilities in place to deploy a certain number of turbines per year, as well as the technology performance characteristics, which dictates how much energy you can get out of a megawatt of offshore wind capacity. We then looked at the electric system and market components, first focusing on transmission and interconnection infrastructure. To what degree would the ability to interconnect the offshore wind supply into the system be a constraining factor? Limits on the penetration of variable energy resources. Market opportunities that could be created by the retirement of older fossil and nuclear units in the legacy fleet. And we also turned to state and regional policies and plans. And here we looked at renewable portfolio standard-driven demand at the state level. We also looked at greenhouse gas emission reduction policy-driven demand, which goes above and beyond the RPS. And we looked at other renewable energy policies and plans. And then we focused on the offshore wind specific procurement policies and plans as well. And within each category, we researched and analyzed the available data, leaned on existing studies wherever available, made assumptions for factors within each component where there were not derived inputs earlier. We'll talk about some of those assumptions along the way in order to develop a range of high and low bounds. We developed a bottom-up spreadsheet model which would assess the impact of each driver or opportunity or constraint, as well as how each of these interacted. We ultimately combined all of that data, the baseline data, the forecast, and the assumptions within each of the three categories and subcategories that were described to test the impact of high and low assumptions on any of the unknowns and determine which factors were most likely to bound offshore wind deployment over time, serving as either a ceiling or a floor. The analysis resulted in high and low offshore wind deployment trajectories between the present and 2030. The high considered what factors might constrain the deployment scale, so we really had a lesser of the different drivers focus. And the low end, we considered what factors might constrain deployment, and so it was something of a lesser of perspective on the analysis, or really what might represent a floor to the deployment volumes. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jordan Shoesmith to talk to us about the offshore wind characteristics.
All right, so I'll be going through the first two analytical components, the offshore wind characteristics, and then the market factors for market components. I will try to get through this pretty quickly given the time, and just note that everything that we discuss here is available in the report, specifically in the appendix, and then obviously there is time for questions at the end. So beginning with the offshore wind resource potential components, or offshore wind characteristics, these are all of the components that or factors that we considered in developing or assessing how the resource potential would affect the trajectory. So the factors analyzed, as we saw earlier, include the regional developable resource potential, the known and near-term development pipeline, current and anticipated federal offshore wind lease areas in the Northeast, the build-out potential or pace at which the region can deploy offshore wind in terms of megawatts per year, and then the annual energy production of offshore wind or capacity factors that offshore wind can achieve. Of these, development pipeline and temporal build-out potential were found to be constraints. The development pipeline was found to be binding in the near-term deployment of offshore wind, but not thereafter, and the build-out potential was found to be a practical ceiling to the regional offshore wind deployment. Put simply, the region can't build more capacity than the industry is capable of deploying over time. How much the region is capable of deploying, however, from a supply chain capability standpoint, is evolving as the industry rapidly advances and transcends some of our assumptions and our understanding of the industry at the time of this analysis. As Bob had alluded to earlier, lots has happened since we conducted this analysis. So, beginning with the offshore wind resource potential components and resource potential, we looked at the net technical potential of offshore wind between 20 to 50 nautical miles from shore, which is where all of the development will likely happen in this time frame. Gross potential, according to the NREL 2016 Offshore Wind Energy Resource Assessment, is around 233 gigawatts, whereas net technical potential, which is net of losses due to transmission and exclusions or competing uses, that amounted to about 180 gigawatts. For perspective, the regional peak demand that includes New England and New York in 2030 is projected to be around 62 gigawatts in the summer and 46 gigawatts in the winter, which is about a third and 1/4 respectively of the net technical potential for the region. So this is certainly not a constraining factor for the build out of offshore wind. Moving on to the lease areas. We've looked at a map like this earlier from Doreen. We looked at each of the leased areas that are currently entirely leased, of which there are 8. And then we also considered the 2 portions of the Massachusetts wind energy area that have not been leased. Cumulatively, these represent about 16 gigawatts of capacity or resource potential. One thing to note is that the New York has recently requested 4 new areas, each of which could facilitate up to an additional 800 megawatts of offshore wind, and the 2 Massachusetts wind energy areas are going to be considered in the near term due to unsolicited lease requests from offshore wind developers. So in considering these, we made a series of assumptions with respect to how much capacity was available for development in each of these areas, or the area types, of which there are the leased, the unleased, future leased areas that we anticipate BOEM to identify, and then New Jersey lease areas. In total, we have about 23 gigawatts of potential. How much of this is available in each of the trajectories? Current lease areas, we have about 100% in the high case and in the low case, given that they are entirely leased, and there's certainty there. In the unleased portions, it's about 175% respectively in the high case and low case. Of future lease areas, again, 100%, 50%, and then New Jersey lease areas, we assume that only one of the lease areas and only 50% of the potential in that lease area would be available for export to either New York or the New England control areas. So this got us trajectories for low and high federal lease area potential of between 14.5 gigawatts and 21.5 gigawatts. Again, this is not a potential constraint to the market in this time frame. We also considered all the offshore wind projects under development. I will not go through each of these projects, but this table is available here as well as in paper. Of interest to us is that the region boasts a development pipeline with a cumulative capacity of up to 8.2 gigawatts, including the nation's first offshore wind project at Block Island Wind, which went online in December 2016, as well as a number of regional projects that will likely be bidding into the Massachusetts Section 83C RFP come next month, and we'll talk about that a little more later. So in assessing which of these projects would make it into our advanced development and construction pipeline, we considered, for the purposes of this analysis, only those projects that were in the advanced stages of development or construction. So in the high case, we included Block Island Wind, which is already operating, the Aquaventus pilot project off the coast of Maine, Deepwater 1 or Deepwater Wind South Fork project, which is was selected by LIPA recently in an RFP, and then the Deepwater 1 expansion, which is 210 megawatt expansion that bid into another LIPA RFP but was not selected. So that gave us our high advanced development construction, and in the low case we only considered the Block Island Wind Farm and the South Fork project, which gave us our low. Moving on to temporal build-out, which is the most important piece of this. Our assumptions, or the scale and rate of regional offshore wind deployment is constrained, albeit moderately, as we will see, by the infrastructure and supply chain available for its facilitation and integration. The first step in this process was to define the overall pool of potential projects, as we saw, the advanced development and construction pipeline, as well as the lease areas that are available, and then to look at how much could be built out of that potential. We assumed in the high case, just to constrain or bound the trajectories, 75% and 50% respectively. And then we considered a number of factors, the type and number of ships, crews, and facilities available, the methods employed for construction, transportation, installation of turbine foundations and components, as well as general industry experience, which, again, this is something that is evolving. It's kind of a moving estimate in terms of how this will affect the industry and what the ultimate build-out rate will be. For the purpose of this analysis, we assumed in the high case that 300 megawatts a year is a achievable build-out rate beginning in 2021, in the low case 2023, and we'll get all the way up to 500 megawatts a year in 2027 in the high case and 2029 in the low case. An important point to make here, however, is that the number of turbines that the industry is capable of deploying in a given year will increase over time as regional infrastructure improves and expands and as supply chain capacity grows and matures, as well as as developers gain industry experience. This is an input that may be too conservative at this point, given when we did the analysis, and could very well exceed our assumptions over the time frame. So this got us low and high trajectories for the build-out of current and future leases, the low, or this is of the current leases in the low and high, and then of future leases, which gets us to totals of between 7 and 14 gigawatts of build-out potential in this time frame. And again, the recent industry experience suggests this could be conservative. So we took the offshore wind development pipeline, or what was an advanced construction and development, as well as the build-out potential, and this kind of created a ceiling for our trajectories, given that the industry can't build more than it's capable of. So I'll move on to the next analytical component, the electric system and market components, which is composed of transmission interconnection, or megawatts available for transmission or for interconnection from the offshore wind areas or projects into the regional grid. Electric market constraints, that is variable energy resource penetration, which we will discuss herein, as well as the electric market opportunities, or those opportunities provided by planned and at-risk retirement. As those go offline, capacity will be needed to replace that, and offshore wind, we assume, has a share of that. So of these, the grid's ability to integrate variable energy resources was seen to be the most constraining, and I will talk about each of those in succession. So for transmission interconnection purposes, we looked at the proximity of certain interconnection points, their available capacity, along with the transmission capacity of key high voltage network lines, and how those will impact the rate and scale of potential offshore wind deployment through 2030. In addition, upstream constraints may further limit the ability to inject offshore wind into some parts of the grid. In this analysis, however, it's important to keep in mind that most of the capacity will come from existing leased areas in southern New England and off the coast of New York, and those will interconnect generally directly into load centers, and the transmission constraints are very minimal in those areas. We developed trajectories for transmission, which got us to between 14 gigawatts and 17 gigawatts between now and 2030, which, given the trajectories, this is this isn't constraining at all in the near term, or within this time frame, sorry. So the next thing that we considered were the opportunities provided by retirement. In doing so, we had to make a bunch of assumptions relating to planned and at-risk retirements. In ISO New England, there's a list of planned retirements that ISO New England created for strategic transmission analysis. We took those into consideration, and then in looking at risk retirements in New York, we made an assumption with respect to all base load generators who have 50 megawatts of capacity or more and an operational age of 40 or higher or older by the year 2020. This gave us about 23 gigawatts of planned and or at-risk retirements within the 2030 timeframe. We created, based on the assumptions, we created extrapolations. So in each of the cases, all planned retirements will retire within this timeframe and as scheduled, and that capacity will be available as those plants retire. There's more information with respect to specific assumptions in the paper. And then for risk retirements of all the at-risk capacity as it retires, or as it is expected to retire, we assume 4% of that at-risk capacity is available in the low case and 8% per year in the high case, which by 2030 gets us to about 6,000 and 12,000 megawatts respectively, or a total market gap created by these retirements of 12 gigawatts and 18 gigawatts respectively in the low and high case. And then we had to make assumptions about how much that gap offshore wind could fill. So we assumed that offshore wind can begin filling that market gap earlier than 2022. In the low case, offshore wind can replace up to 30% of those retirements. In the high case, up to 60%, which gave us our trajectories for offshore wind share of the market gap. So, which got us to about 3,600 megawatts and 10,800 megawatts in the low and high case respectively. Moving on to the most constraining factor in this set of components, ER penetration. So there are practical limits to the bulk power system's ability to absorb its intermittent output. This component or this factor provides a snapshot of a recent analysis of potential limits to the ER penetration over time, developed by NREL. They published the Renewable Electricity Future Study in 2012. It examined the potential for high penetration of various renewable energy technologies, both nationally and regionally, and they take into account geographic, temporal, and operational factors and constraints. We described that study in the paper as well. So offshore wind market penetration, as we said, but keep in mind that advances in energy storage technology, as well as grid integration and grid modernization, could expand the limits of the grid's ability to integrate VER successfully. In addition, one other thing to keep in mind is that increases in load may change these percentages and the amount of capacity that offshore wind, or the amount of offshore wind capacity that the region could demand. Moving on. So one of the assumptions we made was that offshore wind penetration would be constrained by competition with other energy resources. Put simply, that there are existing policies and commitments or procurements for non-offshore wind resources, solar PV, land-based wind, large hydro, even natural gas, and even in those procurements in which offshore wind can participate, such as the recent 83D RFP put out by Massachusetts, where an offshore wind developer did bid in, it is unlikely to win on competition alone, on price competition alone at this point. So other resources may box out offshore wind in the near term and later on in other procurements. Assumptions to estimate a total gigawatt hours of year of offshore wind that could be integrated successfully also included projected energy demand in the region, as we said, the existing procurement and DG policies, the technical penetration potential of VERs, according to the study, which we'll look at in a second, and then a share of that total VER penetration that offshore wind could take. So our major assumptions includes a base VER fleet of 11.5 gigawatts. That's obviously higher now. DG carve-outs and procurements committed to non-offshore wind supply are obviously unavailable to offshore wind. We looked at the ISO New England South and ISO Gold Book forecast, the base case we used in the low case of our trajectories, and the high case of those forecasts we used in our high case for our trajectories. Total VER penetration for incremental uncommitted market demand by 2030 is between 18 and 27%, and the offshore wind share of that residual incremental VERs, that is the incremental uncommitted market demand not already taken up by non-offshore wind resources, would be 25% and between 25% and 70%. We looked at DG carve-outs and non-offshore procurements. We assumed that there would be higher amounts of DG carve-outs and non-offshore procurement capacity in the low case and lower amounts thereof in the high case. And again, the penetration of offshore wind begins in 2023 in the low case and 2021 in the high case. So we got trajectories out of this. That is the existing VER fleet, to give you a sense, followed by the DG set-aside and procurement for the non-offshore wind supply, the non-offshore wind share of total VER penetration thereafter, created by incremental demand, and then the offshore wind share. That gave us these trajectories, which get us to between 1.7 gigawatts and 11.4 gigawatts in the high case. These results suggest the market could potentially be a significant constraint to regional offshore wind deployment, but this ultimately depends on regional demand for renewable energy, the rate and scale of non-offshore wind development, and policy support for offshore wind. At this point, I will hand it back over to Bob Graves.
Okay. Thank you, Jordan. So the third leg of our three-legged stool focused on the role of state and regional policies and plans. And here we focused on renewable portfolio standard demand that could drive offshore wind greenhouse gas policy-driven demand, as well as specific offshore wind goals, plans, procurement targets, and contracting policies. So focusing first on the state and regional plans, the components that we considered, again, were state-specific: RPS demand, greenhouse gas reduction policy-driven demand, other renewables, and offshore wind procurement. And the analysis basically told us that the amount of RPS demand was not constraining, that the greenhouse gas goals could take offshore wind beyond the level of RPS, and also told us that the offshore wind procurement policies and plans effectively could carve out for offshore wind at least a minimum contribution. So the ultimately constraining factors from the high and low end were the greenhouse gas driven demand and the offshore wind procurement and policies. So focusing first on our analysis of RPS demand, we consider the share of future market that an offshore wind fleet could potentially meet to be based on a number of different factors, including the time at which offshore wind can enter the market, so offshore wind can't contribute before then, the existing or other non-offshore wind renewable generation fleet that meets RPS demand prior to offshore wind becoming available. So this basically represents supply that will have come online to meet RPSs before then. It will effectively have locked itself in and be a standing fleet committing to and taking up a good chunk of the available demand. Looking at the incremental demand from that date forward in New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, generally working from existing statute, but in a few cases where some of these demands are being considered for expansion, we considered not just New York's Clean Energy Standard, which had just been implemented and adopted during the course of the analysis. We have assumed for this analysis a 2% annual increase in Massachusetts RPS targets. Right now, by statute, the RPS increases by 1% a year in Massachusetts, but there are several legislative vehicles that are currently being considered to increase that. Rhode Island had just increased its renewable energy standard and extended it through 2035, I believe. And Connecticut is currently, the Connecticut RPS currently stops increasing at 20% of load in 2020, but as a core feature of the state's comprehensive energy strategy, there is a proposal for extending the RPS to 30% by 2030, and we use that assumption in this analysis. To bound the future consideration, we assumed that the offshore wind share of the residual RPS demand not already boxed out by other resources could be 25% of the total incremental RPS demand on the low end, or 50% on the high end. And that resulted in the following. So basically you can see the current operating fleet already boxing out and taking up some of the demand, the expectation of additional supply being driven by various distributed generation policies and other procurement policies for non-offshore wind supply, and then leaving for offshore wind the final wedge available on top in red. Turning to, just to show what this leads to as a RPS demand assumption driver on the low end. RPS alone might drive about 1,200 megawatts. On the high end, about 4,700 megawatts. And as you can see, compared to some of the other factors, that RPS demand really becomes a floor to the contribution of offshore wind over time. We then turn to looking at greenhouse gas emission reduction policy as a potential driver. Now, most of the states in the region have very aggressive regional greenhouse gas reduction policies, and we consider these as a likely upper bound on the policy-driven offshore wind demand. We made a number of assumptions. First of all, we relied on a study performed in 2016 by Synapse Energy Economics, looking at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative opportunity and projecting the quantity of variable energy resources that would be required as part of a suite of all factors or policies to drive greenhouse gas reduction, transportation changes, heating changes, changes to the electric system, in order to meet 40% by 2040, which is generally the interim target for a number of the state policies. So the study projected the number of gigawatt hours per year from wind and solar by state, and we used that as a starting point for the analysis. Again, we took into account the policies and procurements driving non-offshore wind supply, effectively boxing out what share would be available for offshore wind. And then of the residual incremental demand, we assumed that offshore wind could meet either a quarter or a half of that, with the remainder being available to and supplied by land-based wind or solar predominantly. So when you take a look at what those assumptions lead to in terms of quantities, you can see here in energy terms the amount that is locked in for the current supply, the non-offshore wind share of incremental greenhouse gas policy-driven demand, and finally the amount that would be available to offshore wind. So putting these on the scale of our trajectories in megawatts, you can see high and low that the share suggested by this analytical perspective would range from, on the low end, 3,800 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030 to, on the high end, about 7.7 gigawatts by 2030. When we turn to looking at the offshore wind procurement policies and plans, this became really important in establishing the low procurement. So these state and regional policies are indicative of the increasing level of commitment to greenhouse gas reductions as well as renewable energy expansions, and directly towards offshore wind deployment. The policies vary in many different ways, from pilot programs to statutory procurement targets to aspirational non-binding targets. In developing these, we created a low case and high case, which started with the existing development pipeline, which we discussed earlier, and added on to that the Massachusetts offshore wind procurements in statute, 1,600 megawatts, and the New York governor's goal of 2.4 gigawatts to have a set of targets that would ultimately be reached by 2030. And here you can see the ramp up, which mirrors kind of the procurement pattern that is being developed by both Massachusetts and New York. So then when we put all of this together, we had a lot of data, a lot of different perspectives, and we wanted to think about, what are the factors that would either provide a constraint to or ceiling to the amount of offshore wind deployed over time, or effectively support a minimum deployment to create a floor. And so that we call the market assessment step here. And as we had developed all of the different trajectories of the subcomponents of our analysis that we've shown you, here we can put them all together on to one graph. So the low case on the left, the high on the right. We start with the development pipeline and build-out potential. So this considers what's already being developed and the constraints on the rate of development as a function of the number of megawatts per year that could actually be put into operation. We also looked at the incremental VER penetration, which was more considered a constraint in the low end. In the high end, it was well above some of our other factors. The offshore wind share of retirements, which Jordan had described, can also provide a potential constraint in each of these cases. Then we look at the offshore wind penetration to serve greenhouse gas-driven demand. You can see that comes in lower than a number of the other factors and therefore may be constraining. It's very hard to see if the states are fully able to meet their very aggressive goals, that offshore wind could push beyond that level of penetration over time. And finally, the offshore wind procurement policies and targets, shown here on the left for the low case as comprising something of the floor. And so when you put all these together and think about the constraints, we derived in the dotted lines on the left and right our ultimate trajectories. So you can see at various points in the time frame which factors we were considering to be most constraining. On the left, on the low case trajectory, you can see that the procurement policies and targets were seen as the floor, and any of the other subcomponents would allow development above that floor. To the degree that offshore wind share of retirements or offshore wind penetration to serve greenhouse gas-driven demand might be considered a ceiling, you can see a crossover between 2029 and 2030, where if those were considered to be a ceiling, we might have had a somewhat lower quantity of development by 2030, but the existence of the offshore wind procurement policies and targets effectively dictates a policy decision that offshore wind could take a slightly bigger share of the available pie in that time frame. Similarly, looking to the high case trajectory, you can see that in the near term, the development pipeline and the build-out potential are constraining factors, but as the industry ramps up, you could see that eventually that becomes non-constraining and some of the other factors become a more significant constraint, and ultimately offshore wind penetration to serve greenhouse gas-driven demand becomes the upper bound here. Again, being difficult to envision that offshore wind could really lap the field on greenhouse gas policies. So some major takeaways, conclusions, and considerations for this analysis are first of all that the offshore wind deployment trajectories were assembled by combining all of these component analyses, and that the high offshore wind deployment trajectory was the lesser of the development pipeline and build-out potential in the near term, the potential for variable energy resource penetration in the midterm, and ultimately the greenhouse gas policy-driven demand in the long term, whereas the low development trajectory was ultimately driven by and supported by commitments to procure offshore wind throughout the region. The targets exceed and overcome some of the constraints inherent in some of the other analytical perspectives, and if other states were to add to the procurement volume, for example, the Connecticut example that I gave, the floor could be lifted even further. It's important to understand that there are a lot of new developments in the Northeast from a policy perspective, from an electric market perspective, as well as advancements in the offshore wind industry that postdated a lot of the work in this analysis. We read every week about further leaps and bounds in Europe for the offshore wind industry being able to deploy more offshore wind per unit time at lower cost, and the degree to which that learning and that infrastructure is translated into the U.S. can impact, at least for some parts of our time frame, some of the constraints. And in general, these movements seem to all be pointing towards a general upward shift in the trajectory of the envelope that our analysis has suggested. So again, the bottom line here is a vision of the future scale of offshore wind for the Northeast that would ramp up over time, on the low end hitting about 1,000 megawatts in 2025 and getting to 4,000 megawatts by 2030, and on the high end getting up to about almost 2,000 megawatts by 2023, and ultimately could be almost as high as 8,000 megawatts by 2030, given all the different factors that are available to us today. So at this point, we appreciate your participating. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Bob and Jordan. Okay, we can move on to the Q&A section of this webinar, and we will take questions for both Doreen and Bob and Jordan. So let's start with some questions for you, Bob and Jordan, since your presentation is fresh on our mind. And before I begin, I want to thank you for the thorough overview you just gave of the methodology used in your comprehensive analysis. given that there was a lot of technical details and just so much information, I wanted to start with some broad overview questions. So the study focused on policies in three states, but at least the roadmap project does. But to what extent can you review how what policies from other states you included in your analysis? For example, you mentioned New Jersey's new goal and Connecticut's new procurement goal as well. And though those were not included in the analysis, was there potential already counted for?
Sure. In effect, we took into account the other states in New England's load, demand, and the retirements driven by that demand, the RPS and greenhouse gas volumes. And so in considering the ultimate contribution of demand pull from those states, those factors were ultimately considered in the analysis. We did not consider any demand pull from New Jersey, for example. On the one hand, demand pull was considered very broadly. One thing that was not explicitly considered was the recently adopted Massachusetts Clean Energy Standard, which in the near term is expected to boost the demand for RPS Class 1 resources, which could be met theoretically by offshore wind. But if Massachusetts ends up procuring large-scale hydro through its current Section 83D procurement authority, going forward, we would expect most of that incremental demand from the Clean Energy Standard to be met by large hydro. On the other hand, if the procurement does not include large hydro, it could potentially open up some additional demand. We did not include the procurement from Connecticut. If we were to include it, and if Connecticut deployed the entire statutory authority available to them towards offshore wind, by our calculations, that could add up to 270 megawatts, and that would effectively scale up the impact of that would scale up the low trajectory proportionally. So once that first tranche of offshore wind really kicked in the 2022-23 time period and thereafter, you could potentially see that floor lifted by another 250, 270 megawatts or so in that case. The New Jersey procurement goals, if they turn into something more binding than a candidate's aspirations, would certainly drive more supply into being, but that would not necessarily impact the trajectory, since those are not goals to meet demand in our region of interest.
Great, thanks. Another question for you, Bob, and it's a two-part question. So the second part is for Doreen. So did the study look at any grid connection issues and that impact on the trajectories in the report? And then the second part of the question is, if not, will the roadmap project dive into grid issues?
Sure. And Jordan, while I'm answering this, I'm going to ask you to pull up a graph. We had, I believe, a graphic that showed deployment over time as a function of interconnection constraints that's in the report itself. Mm-hmm. So if you can get that. So what we did in considering interconnection, there were a number of existing studies of various vintages and level of detail. Massachusetts Clean Energy Center had commissioned a study by ESS Group in 2014 that looked at the major interconnection points available for offshore wind in the Massachusetts and Rhode Island areas. So we basically looked at each of those specific interconnection points. There was another study that was available in that allowed us to look at potential interconnection points in Maine. New York has been looking at a number of different studies. NYSERDA has conducted some internally, and both ISO, New York ISO, ISO New England, there are a number of studies out there. So we basically took a look at the various studies that were available. We made some specific assumptions based on those and identified timeframes in which they would become available. So some of the interconnection points, for example, are predicated on retirement of existing generation there. We'll take the Brayton Point power plant in Somerset, Massachusetts as an example. You know, a material fossil steam power plant, several units, all retiring this year, and effectively we've seen, even since the analysis, several interconnection requests for that site. So similarly, there are a number of the other potential sites that were dependent on retirements in various places or future upgrades. So I believe it was in our slide, let's see, was it this one? No, this one, yes. So slide 25 basically shows the temporal development or availability over time of those interconnection points that we specifically studied. The studies that we cited and our assumptions are all laid out in the report itself.
Great, thank you. Great. Doreen, anything to add?
No, I think Bob covered the extent of the work that was part of this study, and there are no further studies as part of this regional work that we anticipate considering transmission and interconnection through on a regional basis. That said, the roadmap may point to areas of future work between the states that would make sense in this regard. I mean, specifically, as Bob mentioned, there's a lot going on a state-by-state basis in this regard, and the question of collaboration between the states is one that we've discussed as, you know, between states as part of this process and others.
All right, thank you. Bob and Jordan, did the study consider the impacts of competition, for example, shortage of construction vessels or supply chain constraints on the low and high build-out scenarios?
It did not explicitly consider that. In effect, we did what we might call a parametric analysis, considering that factors such as the availability of equipment, but also the competition for that equipment, might limit the build-out as defined by a metric of megawatts per year that could be constructed. And so we considered a range of those megawatts per year of construction between 300 and 500, ramping up over time at different paces. So our intent was to really try to bound the potential. In developing those, our subcontractor, AWS True Power, had done some more granular consideration or assumptions of the number of ships that would be available over time, for example. And so implicit in those assumptions are that if there's one ship available, it can only be in one place at one time, and therefore that might effectively, at least at a rough level, consider that type of competition.
Thank you. Now, I should have asked this of you earlier when I asked about New Jersey and Connecticut, but you had mentioned Maine as part of the market contribution, I believe, in the low market scenario, if I'm correct. But there are a few questions have come up about to what extent Maine's demand played into the RMC or Maine's project, the proposed Aquaventus project, played in the report.
Sure. So yeah, the Aquaventus project is one of the projects. It's a 12 megawatt pilot program floating project, which is getting near to that. I guess getting advanced in the development pipeline and getting near to the point where if they can secure a viable offtake contract and interconnect and get permitted the cable landfall, they can move forward. So we had considered them as part of the pipeline in both the in just the high case, since there's some uncertainty there. So that's how the Aquaventus is considered. Maine was not considered to be a major driver of demand per se. The RPS in Maine effectively by statute stops increasing after 2017 and potentially goes away after 2022. But because it's effectively already hitting its ceiling before offshore wind, any effective quantity of offshore wind would be able to come online, the main RPS would not be a material driver of any additional support. Maine does not have any procurement policies to assure any future or to effectively create direct push of supply into the marketplace, and ultimately Maine's share of the overall greenhouse gas policies was taken into account in that Synapse study and considering the overall region's pull. In general, for supply that could plug into Maine, Maine has a much deeper waters and does not have the continental shelf available to much of the rest of the region, and so the technologies that would be deployed at scale in Maine ultimately would be primarily the floating technology, which is not today the most cost effective. We've seen some studies come out of NREL recently that suggested by around 2030 floating offshore wind could be competitive on cost with fixed bottom offshore wind, and so the potential role of Maine and Maine supply might just be off the chart to the right here to some degree. A study given more time might see more Maine supply contribute, but would need to have some more specific policies driven in Maine for Maine demand to be driving that.
Yeah, for more perspective, Europe, the first commercial floating offshore wind project just became operational in Europe just this year. So.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few hybrid questions for Doreen and both you, Bob and Jordan. So, did the regional market characterization report or the roadmap consider workforce development? So, a few questions here. Did the RMC include an analysis of the workforce? And again, this goes back to, did the study consider, impacts of competition or shortages from having or lacking a trained workforce? And did the study identify any skills gaps? And if not, is this going to be part of the larger roadmap project?
So I guess I'll quickly start here before turning this over to Doreen. So this study did not encompass any kind of a detailed analysis of workforce or detailed supply chain. In effect, as Doreen had mentioned, there was another study which was started after, and I believe the the scale of industry may have fed from this analysis into that one, that really would be looking at some of the workforce and supply chain issues. But for any detail there, I need to turn this over to Doreen.
Thanks, Bob. And yes, the jobs study, Val, maybe you can jump in with the date of that webinar. I'm sorry, I don't remember the date.
December 7th.
There we go. The jobs study that will be covered on the December 7th webinar did speak to an assessment of the needs that would exist. What does the supply chain comport with from the perspective of needs really from the supply chain. What it did not do was look at this gap analysis as the questioner had asked, although I do know that such considerations have been taken up in the individual states. Specifically, Massachusetts has done quite a bit of work in the workforce arena, and NYSERDA, as part of the master plan, has conducted a gap analysis to identify training needs that we have and sort of the timing of that need to fulfill not only our own demand as a state, but also looking at this regionally as well. So I think between the individual states and the job study, we'll cover those questions fully.
Great, thank you. Let's transition to a few questions about the roadmap project itself. And on similar lines as the last question, what about the impacts from a shortage of U.S. construction vessels or lift ship vessels? Has the roadmap project done any work addressing this issue?
Well, the third study that we undertook as part of this project really sought to quantify not only the technical specifications of a U.S. flagged installation vessel, but also the demand at which such an investment would be financeable or make sense, essentially from the perspective of a typical investor. And the conclusions really said that with this collective level of demand, there is a case to make such an investment. So I would encourage a review of that report for some additional insights.
Thank you. Yes, and we did host a webinar on this. I believe it was back in August, possibly early September, and you can find a recording of that webinar on our website. What other technical or market factors or issues will the roadmap project cover, or has it covered?
So the roadmap work products are the three that I identified at the beginning of this webinar. With regard to the actual roadmap that we will complete in fulfillment of the DOE grant, but also in terms of our own work, we are looking at possible activities that the states could potentially take together moving forward. I mean, it's important to note that not all the states will necessarily participate in all of the activities, but we are considering them, as well as really the inclusion of additional states to become involved. Again, there's been some substantial changes in the offshore wind market in the U.S. since we initiated this project, and we look forward to bringing other states together. But the various categories that we're looking at as part of areas that we may work on together include the topic of procurement, not necessarily joint procurements, but timing of procurements. We recognize that construction schedules overlapping can create some unintended consequences of cost. We also seek to collaborate just on best practices for procurement. There's areas of supply chain that we think we should be working together on, specifically as we move forward with actual projects. And we see areas within the assessment of research needs that are also areas the state should work together on, or could work together on, as well as workforce development needs, as asked by an earlier questioner. In fact, transmission is another area we see an opportunity for future collaboration on as well. So those are the major categories, and they'll be covered on a high level in the roadmap.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions that we've received. So we can end just a few minutes early. I want to thank again all our panelists for such excellent presentations, and the audience for listening in and sticking with us on a long webinar. We appreciate your interest in offshore wind, and want to put a plug in for our next webinar, which, as we've mentioned just a few minutes ago, will be on job creation in offshore wind, which is the third report that Doreen mentioned as part of this roadmap project for multi-state cooperation. That's going to be December 7th at noon Eastern. This webinar, again, has been recorded, and you'll be able to find it on our website at the northeastwindcenter.org. Thank you, everyone.